Has Prime Minister John Major had enough of Northern Ireland? Is the British government plotting to rip the Union asunder? Recent signals from Stormont have been interpreted by many Unionists as clear evidence that the government's commitment is weakening. Tonight on Counterpoint, we ask, how safe is the Union? You'll hear from Unionist grassroots, more suspicious than ever before of Britain's long-term strategy. And we'll have the response of the main political parties. But first, this report from UTV's political correspondent, Norman Stockton.
Sir Patrick Mayhew, whether fairly or unfairly, faces a major crisis of confidence with a large section of the Unionist community. And it seems to arise from a perception that he, more than any other Secretary of State before him, is lacking in interest in the future of the Union. It was a speech he made at Coleraine in December which unleashed a wave of anxiety and anger in the pro-Union community. Sir Patrick's renewed appeal to the IRA to give up violence and join the political debate on Northern Ireland's future, coupled with remarks that he was a facilitator, someone without vested interest in the province's future, which stunned DUP and Unionist political leaders. Peter Robinson challenged Sir Patrick to reveal his position on the Union.
The Secretary of State tell the House in clear and simple terms, does he and does the government want Northern Ireland to remain an integral part of the United Kingdom?
I've made it very clear, as have predecessor administrations, that so long as the democratic will of the people living in Northern Ireland clearly expressed leads to their wishing to remain part of the United Kingdom, then the government wishes them to remain part of the United Kingdom, and what is more, will honour the constitutional guarantee that has been given to them in that regard.
And the criticism wasn't confined to the usual sources. John Alderdice of Alliance thought the Coleraine speech hinted at withdrawal and even suggested Sir Patrick and Chris Patten in Hong Kong were vying with each other to see who could first effect a pullout.
Successive Secretaries of State have now made it quite clear that the British government is neutral on the question of Northern Ireland remaining within the United Kingdom. That's also been pointed out by John Hume, and I think he's correct on it. And I think that Secretaries of State have now repeated that to the point where we're quite clear that's the situation.
Gerry Adams of Sinn Féin had read Sir Patrick's Coleraine speech and agreed with observers that the bulk of it had been addressed to the Republican community. He observed a loss of will by Britain to remain. He said to a roar of approval, "Our desire for freedom is greater than the British will to remain in our country." Unionists feared he might be right. At the other end of the political spectrum, right-wing Tory MP Nick Budgen, a leading member of the Friends of the Union organisation, understood Unionist anxieties arising from the Coleraine speech, but hoped their fears were exaggerated.
I think the Coleraine speech has to be taken against the background of the policy of the Northern Ireland Office over very many years towards the Unionist community. The Unionist community have been undermined by constitution mongering and by various forms of agreement with the South, which has made many people in the Unionist community feel very uneasy.
But do you not think there's a sense of almost paranoia in their criticism of that particular speech?
No, I repeat, it's part of the background. If you set up an arrangement by which the South have the right to interfere in the affairs of the North, people who feel that they're about to be taken over and that the English are manoeuvring for their takeover, are bound to feel super sensitive.
Doubts in the minds of local Conservatives about their party's commitment to the Union were expressed at the party conference last year.
The simple fact that Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom has not been seen to be on the agenda. Political development within the democratic system of British government cannot happen until this is truly believed and known in the bones of those responsible for our government.
And now the first Conservative councillor elected in Northern Ireland has deserted to the Unionists because of the Coleraine speech. David Green, who once had Peter Brooke in his canvassing team, now mistrusts the Tory leadership in spite of several speeches which Sir Patrick has made since the Coleraine address, in which he has sought to reassure Unionists about his position on the Union.
I joined the Conservative Party thinking that was going to strengthen the links with the United Kingdom, but I was very disappointed and very disillusioned by what Sir Patrick said. And I think that certainly the Conservative Party is shifting in their views on Northern Ireland.
What do you think Sir Patrick's trying to achieve at the moment?
I think he's trying for a gradual withdrawal over a number of years. I think there's no doubt about that now.
Have you ever talked to Sir Patrick Mayhew about what his policy is on Northern Ireland?
No, Sir Patrick is very aloof. Sir Patrick, unlike his predecessors, has no real contact with Conservatives in Northern Ireland as I once was. Previously, Northern Ireland Conservatives got speaking quite often to government ministers. That seems to have stopped now.
Robin Wilson, editor of the influential magazine Fortnight, eloquently summed up the effect on Unionists of Sir Patrick's Coleraine remarks.
Unionists who recall how they were lectured at the time of the Anglo-Irish Agreement on how it would marginalise republicanism, now watch dumbfounded as not only does IRA violence continue unabated, but Sinn Féin appears more and more central to the British agenda. They perceive as arrayed against them the unified forces of the SDLP and Dublin, with only an ambivalent British state beside them. A more certain recipe for vicious Loyalist violence could hardly be devised. For what drives Loyalist terror, witness the peaks of the early and mid-70s, is heightened constitutional uncertainty.
Glen BARRE in Londonderry, a leading figure in the Workers' Council strike which brought down the power-sharing executive, confirms Wilson's interpretation of current Loyalist thinking.
I think that the Protestant population are concerned just exactly what it is the British government are at this moment. We are very concerned at the pronouncements he has been making now for some time, and we feel that the British government are going to have to come clean on exactly what their future plans are for this province.
What is your suspicion?
We believe quite clearly that Patrick Mayhew, I think that has been sent here to sicken the living daylights out of the Protestants. We feel totally alienated. We don't seem to have a Secretary of State that knows exactly what's going to take place in Northern Ireland. Or if he does, he certainly is playing a game that, as far as we would be concerned, is to totally frustrate Protestants and seem to be totally alienate them from the British government altogether. We've had Secretaries of States down through the years who have all been getting their strings pulled by John Hume, and I think that this one now here, certainly as far as I'm concerned, is the master puppeteer of the whole lot.
In a wide-ranging contribution to the Opsahl Commission, Church of Ireland Primate Dr. Robin EAMES expressed Protestant worries about their position, which was producing a backs-to-the-wall atmosphere.
The preponderance of anxieties now is based on the fact that they see themselves as a minority in Ireland as a whole, rather than those thoughts which have stemmed from a feeling of being a majority in Northern Ireland. A lot of Protestants would say to you that their genuine case and their genuine aspirations have been misunderstood by the rest of the world. They see themselves very much at times as being in the dock of world opinion.
What appears to add to the frustration of the pro-union parties is Sir Patrick's assertion that any new arrangement on devolution has to have general agreement and must be fair. Unionists and Alliance say that means the SDLP can stop anything being created within Northern Ireland, which would mean the British and Irish governments would then have to consider an alternative strategy. John Hume, who's currently in the United States pressing the new president and Irish America to help moves towards greater Irish influence in Northern Ireland, had told the party faithful at the last conference what he wanted next.
The SDLP have proposed the establishment of a North-South Council of Ministers, modelled on the European Council of Ministers, with decisions taken by consensus, that is, by agreement of each side.
Kevin McNamara, Labour's Northern Ireland spokesman, thinks Sir Patrick's recent speeches don't threaten the Union, simply indicate he doesn't know which way he's headed. But he agrees with John Hume that if there's a failure to reach a settlement, then North-South links should be developed.
I think there'll be a greater sharing of responsibilities, a greater realisation of the fact that there are two different allegiances within the North, that there is a different constitutional and historical perspective about the whole of the situation within the North, and that will be found reality in greater cooperation between the two governments.
Dick Spring, the Republic's Deputy Prime Minister, while trying to be helpful, didn't dispel Unionist fears when during a recent speech he confirmed his knowledge of their current mental state.
The Unionist community has seen many of the bulwarks of their position disappear in this century. They are deeply concerned that there may be no point of safety between where they now stand and the realization of their worst fears. They suspect that all political movement must be to their detriment.
John Alderdice, sensitive to the dangers of ascendancy by one side or another, cautions against forcing through the final nationalist agenda.
Most of the political developments over the past number of years have been spearheaded by the SDLP, and I think that they have been very successful indeed in making political progress from their particular point of view. I think that they must, however, be a little bit anxious that they must build on what they have done so far, and they must try to achieve some kind of victory. And that's not always the best way to achieve peace, because what they may find themselves doing is driving unionists into a corner, making the unionist community feel isolated, humiliated, turn to more violence. And of course, that's just a repetition of the problem unionists created years ago. It's not a solution.
And unionists are made constantly aware that apart from the cost, Northern Ireland continues to be Britain's biggest international embarrassment. Irish America continues to protest about the security measures created to respond to terrorism. And during the recent first meeting between US President Bill Clinton and Mr. Major, the only fly in the ointment of the so-called special relationship was an exchange about alleged British breaches of human rights in Northern Ireland. With so many apparently ranged to attack the status of Northern Ireland, small wonder Sir Patrick Mayhew's less than firm statements of commitment to the Union have the pro-Union parties in a state of high anxiety that they are in a no-win position.
David Trimble of the Ulster Unionists, why shouldn't the British government withdraw? We cost them a fortune, and all we do is bicker.
Probably don't cost them as much as Liverpool does, or any other region in the northwest of England or the west of Scotland, which is economically depressed as a result of this depression. So I think that financial factor is something which is really not appropriate. There's not going to be, and I think I'm sorry to say that your introduction into this is a little bit alarmist, there is not going to be a British scuttle.
What makes you so sure of that?
It's simply not possible. Anybody who sits and thinks it through must realise that it's not possible. The fear is not of a scuttle. The fear is of a government that is trying to manoeuvre us into some unwelcome situation, and Stockton takes that from the Coleraine speech. But then if you look at the speech on the 2nd of March, you get a different message. If you look at the speech last weekend to the Northern Ireland Conservatives, you get another message. The problem is that the Secretary of State is saying different things to different audiences, and that is leaving uncertainty as to what the policy of the British government actually is. And that uncertainty, coupled with the way in which the inter-party talks last year allowed the Irish government to appear to raise constitutional issues, has produced the anxiety that's here.
And the uncertainty is very, very high, and Seamus Mallon, it is perhaps partly down to the SDLP. You could have chosen to build trust with the local parties and then the structures, like the Anglo-Irish Agreement. You did it the other way around, and therefore, of course, there is no trust.
Well, are you going to blame us because of the success that John Alderdice here attributed to us and that the previous part of the programme did? It's the business of a political party to look after its own affairs.
So do you feel you've won, or you're winning?
I don't think we should be blamed for that.
No, but you feel you're winning?
I wouldn't look at it in those terms at all. I think there is a problem, and the problem is that the Secretary of State and the British government aren't following the Unionist agenda. They may be Unionist themselves. They may have Unionist ambitions in the long term, but they are not following a Unionist agenda. And that's the problem with the parties sitting around the table here. That is what is unnerving Unionists, and that is what is coming through from Sir Patrick, despite his agony-aunt statements almost every week towards the Unionists that David has spoken about, which I think are very condescending. If I were a Unionist, I'd find them bloody insulting, and I would have thought that the Unionist position in relation to the solution to this problem is best protected and best defended within this island of Ireland, and not by a type of tenuous link with Britain, which I believe is uncertain from a Unionist point of view, and I believe they are right to question.
Now, the SDLP, obviously you've got an objective, you've got a very clear strategy. It's clear enough for John Alderdice, when the talks broke down, to criticise the SDLP for not moving from that.
Well, the reality of the situation, it seems to me, is that the British government, if one looks not at a particular speech, but at the situation over quite a period of time, is engaged in a kind of managed drift. And their position on the constitutional future of Northern Ireland, I think, is a relatively neutral one. They've made that very clear. It seems to me that what is important, if we're not going to have a very unbalanced and dangerous situation, that the Irish government should now begin to redefine its interest in Northern Ireland in the same kind of way, so that it doesn't back any particular group in Northern Ireland, but looks for peace and for some kind of agreement with all the different political parties in Northern Ireland, and indeed with the two governments.
Could I suggest that that's quite wishful thinking, and to bring Sammy Wilson in, as I say, the SDLP have a clear objective of strategy. The Unionists appear to have an objective, maintaining the Union. But what's your strategy? What is it?
Well, I think that first of all, one must recognise that there are two parties in the Union. One is the British government, and the other are the Unionist community here in Northern Ireland.
But that's not a party, that's a Unionist community, and many parties within the community.
Well, I think that we must take issue as to what is the position of the British government. One particular group within the Union has decided that they don't wish to stay. They don't wish to maintain the Union. I think that that's been quite clear, not just from the Coleraine speech that Sir Patrick Mayhew made. It was clear when the Anglo-Irish Agreement was set up. It has been clear ever since. It was clear during the Stormont talks when we found a Secretary of State who was quite happy to sit back and not challenge the claim which another country made on the territory of Northern Ireland. And that creates a difficulty, because you've got a partner which is not prepared to back the Union, and in fact which at the minute is holding some of the cords and starting to let them go.
But is that not your own fault for not having a strategy?
No, it's not our own fault.
Encourage your partner to do what you want.
Well, it's not our own fault. I mean, I think that you've got to recognise that one of the reasons why the British government is starting to move away is because they have given in to terrorism. They have accepted, they have looked at the situation and they have said, which side is most likely to cause difficulties for us? And it's the provosts who have called the shots and who at this stage have led the British government towards a situation where it is, I think, trying to weigh up what is the most costly option. And the most costly option for it is to hold on to the Union. Now, Unionists must get the message over, and we've got to start on the British population. We must not allow terrorism to pay, and your government mustn't allow terrorism to pay.
But if you're agreed that the British government have moved from pro-Union back into neutral, how come the SDLP are succeeding with their objective and strategy, and you Unionists are not?
Because the SDLP have got the provosts working along the same line, and the British government, as always, as they have done in other parts of the world, are saying who can cause us the most difficulty, and that's the line we'll go along.
But I would hope you're not saying that that is anything other but accidental.
Well, I would have thought it's one of these old hoary chestnuts that crop up when people have run out of arguments. I think you put your finger on it yourself when you referred to the British government as the partner of unionism. And what has happened is that they have ceased to be the partner. They have adopted a position which has said to the unionist parties, look, stand on your own feet. We have got a position, and I believe their long-term position is based on the type of thinking that Enoch Powell was very afraid of when he referred to the vipers within the Foreign Office, and I think there's a certain amount of truth from a unionist point of view on that. But if you look at the census returns, I think that that is what the British government is very much aware of, and what unionism should be doing now is what Dick Spring suggested to them, and that is to try and ensure the type of position on this island from the position of strength that they have at the present moment of time, rather than relying on a broken reed, because as far as it goes, gentlemen, Britain is a broken reed as far as you're concerned and as far as the rest of us are concerned.
But is the SDLP not responsible for that?
Well, if the SDLP is responsible for making the British government face up to the reality, to the failure of partition, because that's what we're really talking about. We're talking about trying to make the unworkable work, and that's what it has been since 1921. If we are responsible for that, I will take that as a compliment.
David Trimble doesn't seem to be going very well for you.
No, but it's not going very well for the SDLP either, and I think this programme and this discussion exaggerates the extent of so-called SDLP success. They managed to con the British in 1985 and get them shackled with the Anglo-Irish Agreement. But that agreement, that process that it was supposed to launch, has been stuck fast ever since. We're working on a different agenda. Now, we haven't actually worked that agenda fully through yet.
Well,
but
exactly.
Could I say something else to you?
But what have you achieved since '85 while they have achieved the Anglo-Irish Agreement?
We've stopped the Anglo-Irish Agreement moving in the direction that it was intended to in 1985. But what I wanted to say to you is this, that this programme is like Hamlet without the ghost. It's supposed to be an examination of the policy of the British government, and specifically of the Northern Ireland Office. Where are they? They should be here so that we can discuss with them what their policy is and find out what Sir Patrick really means when he says one thing on Coleraine and a different thing on the 2nd of March and a different thing on the 13th of March again. And that is what we should be doing. Instead of here making guesses and allowing people to put out some rather alarmist propaganda, there may very well be, as John says, a degree of drift in British policy. But the way that drift is to be addressed is through proper debate, not through having them absent.
But do you not think, if I might say, because you suggested that my comments were a measure of wishful thinking, and I think it's not wishful thinking to suggest that people ought to be addressing not just the question of the British government's view, because I think everybody is actually around this table fairly much agreed on the British government's view, and that is that any involvement is on the basis of duty rather than affection. I think one does have to look then at the question, not just of the part that our parties play, but at the part that the Irish government plays. Is it going to be playing a constructive role in Northern Ireland, trying to create a more balanced arrangement in Northern Ireland, or is it going to take a partisan position? And I hope that as they begin to look more seriously at what is going on in Northern Ireland, that there will be a less partisan and more constructive approach.
Well, what is the Irish government's position? I mean, would they not run a mile if we said you've got 1.5 million extra citizens tomorrow morning, now go and look after them, feed them, clothe them, give them jobs?
I think they probably would. But I think this is the strength of the position, in the political position for all of us in the north of Ireland, that we know we're not particularly wanted by anybody. The reality of the situation, I think, is dawning on the Unionist parties. It was spelt out very clearly, don't forget, in the Forum report, the economic consequences of the type of unity that has been talked about. Is it not within the bounds of possibility that we can sit down together and work out a type of arrangement which will not trample over anyone, which will allow us to develop within this island, which will allow us to create circumstances where we all can regain our self-respect? Because I take no joy out of seeing unionism treated in the way it is treated, especially by these weekly statements of Patrick Mayhew's. That gives me no satisfaction whatsoever. But what I would say is this, and I would ask the three parties around the table to recognise that the benchmark, as far as you're concerned with the British position, is in Article 1C of the Anglo-Irish Agreement, where it says if there is a majority in the north of Ireland in favour of Irish unity, that they introduce the legislation for it. Now, let me give you an analogy for that.
Well, now we're tight for time.
Yes, I'll be very quick. It's like saying to your wife, darling, I love you. But if you really want a divorce, I've got a lawyer in the next room, and let's do it now. That's what it's saying.
If you were a unionist, would you be worried, yes or no?
I'd be very worried indeed. I would look at the strengths around me, and I would play to my own strengths rather than rely on somebody else.
You're a unionist with a small u. You're worried. There's drift.
I'm a Northern Ireland person, and I think everybody in Northern Ireland ought to be very concerned, because if we don't find a political agreement, then the men of violence come into the ascendancy. I think all of us need to be concerned about what's going on.
Sammy Wilson, are you concerned? Does it go as far as concern for withdrawal by the British?
Well, I think I've made that very clear. It goes as far as concern. And the one thing which unionists shouldn't be doing is taking Seamus Mallon's advice and cutting the cords themselves. And I think that's what he's invited us to do here this evening.
David Trimble, how worried are you about withdrawal?
I very much resent the sort of condescension that Seamus has engaged in on this evening. It's designed to goad people into reacting wrongly, and I hope they will not react wrongly. The Union is not in danger in the way that it has been portrayed. We have a rather weak Secretary of State who is dithering. We've got a British government at the moment that is preoccupied with economic affairs. It needs to find its feet. It needs to address this issue properly. It needs to do what it is doing to Scotland, and that is to look firmly for ways of strengthening the Union, and that is the point we will press on them.
In a word, if we're addressing the unionist grassroots, would you say, do not panic?
That's just what I've said.
David Trimble, Sammy Wilson, thank you for joining us. Also to Seamus Mallon and to John Alderdice. Well, that's all for this week, but we'll be back next Thursday at the regular time. That's 10:40. Thanks for your company, and from the Counterpoint team, good night.
And you can now choose from an exciting range of travel games. They'll make your journey fly by.
Power Stick, the new wide stick from Shure, contains a deodorant which actually responds to changes in body heat. The harder you work, the harder it works. Whatever your day demands. New Shure Power Stick, power protection on demand.
Boys and spots. Has she got problems? She needs Clearasil lotion. It cleanses pore deep to remove twice as much grease as cosmetic cleansers. Use it every day to help prevent spots. So much for her spots. Now she's got another problem. Spot the difference with Clearasil.
How will your dog feel about new Spiller's Good Life? It's a dog's life without good life.
Now's the time of year to pick a crisp, juicy Washington apple. When it comes to the crunch, it's gotta be Wellworth's.
Earlier we were talking, and I think I ended by saying that there might be a lot of sceptical people watching who would say, well now look, I don't really believe that Mr. Brooke has secured anything that could be regarded as an agreement, and indeed what is even more important, I think it's highly unlikely he ever will. And therefore it is about time he thought about an alternative. Now the problem with what he's trying to do, these skeptics I think might say, is that he's trying to secure an agreement between the Northern Ireland parties. Well, of course, that's wonderful. It's much better to have an agreement if you can get it. How nice to all sit round the table and have a good old English compromise, and at the end of the day, all is well, and out you can go, and the peace is established. The big snag with it isn't ever going to happen. They won't agree, ever. So why doesn't Mr. Brooke consider what seems to be a very sensible alternative, which is to impose a settlement? Shouldn't he be thinking of that as an alternative?
That's a question.
It is a question. Shouldn't you be thinking of imposing a settlement?
No, I mean...
Why?
No, I wasn't. I was responding to the generality of what you'd said. In terms of what we've been pursuing for the past 2 years, we've been pursuing it against a background, obviously, of having considered the other alternatives previously. And the reason we have been pursuing what we have been pursuing is because it actually seemed the most logical runner of all those that we were looking at. But of course, as you rightly say, there are alternatives, and those remain. And the imposition of a settlement or the imposition of a solution is one of those which exists. There are a couple of arguments which I would put in response to that. The first is a bilateral imposition, an imposition which was not dissimilar to the contribution made by the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which was quite clearly an action taken by the two governments jointly, and which then had the reaction that it did have from the Unionist side of the community, which effectively stifled all political dialogue for effectively 4 years. In other words, when I arrived in July of '89, I was coming at a point when Unionist politicians, I mean, in the manner that you and I would be familiar to in Westminster, were not even communicating with ministers on Westminster business. They were writing to permanent secretaries. All dialogue had in fact broken down, and since it had broken down with government, it had effectively broken down in terms of multilateral, multi-party conversations as well. Not totally, but it had, effectively. So the problem about a joint approach by the two governments is given the demographic factors of Northern Ireland, is it not being effective. Now, there's a separate proposition which you could make in the context of Northern Ireland alone, but not embracing the other parts, the other elements of the structure which we've previously envisaged, which involves the Irish government, where I or the Secretary of State, the British government, would say this is how it's going to be. Now, we had quite a lot of discussion during the talks last year as to what extent Ulstermen are Irishmen and to what extent what their links are with the rest of the United Kingdom. But the one thing which I am quite clear about from my study of Irish history, that Englishmen laying down the law and saying what's going to happen is one of the swiftest methods of making sure that it doesn't actually happen. That there is then not a conspiracy, but there is perhaps an unconscious alliance to make sure that it doesn't happen. Now, I think in terms of your proposition, and I hasten to say that the second scenario I've adopted does not include the Irish government, and therefore does not have the advantage of being able to bring in the Irish dimension into any settlement which we would have. But the feature of the process which we've been using, which you might interpret as imposition, but which I would not, is that, and I said before the break, that the parties have a difficulty in putting forward propositions themselves without knowing what the reaction is going to be on the other side of the table. What can happen when we've actually had a discussion which indicates what is the size of the difference, which is exactly what we were doing between January 90 and March 91. We gradually narrowed the differences between the parties, and then I put a proposition to everybody and said, you know, if you can accept this, we can go forward. If you can't, we can't. That it seems to me a possibility in the process which we're now pursuing that you'd reach the point where the parties said to me, Secretary of State, you've heard everything. You've seen the difficulty which we might have in individually putting forward propositions. We would be grateful if you would go away and come back and make a suggestion. But that is a totally different scenario than my simply coming down off Mount Sinai and saying, you know, I've been thinking about that up on the top of the mountain, and here are the tablets which are now going to be brought in.
Sure, it is a different scenario, and I'm not talking about that. Nor, by the way, do I particularly want to talk about a bilateral imposition. I'm interested in the British government imposing a settlement on Northern Ireland. And there's one thing in what you said, but I'm not clear about at all, and I'd like you to expand. You say, yes, well, they're very sad, they're Irishmen perhaps, or they're Ulstermen, and if you impose anything on them, you get all sorts of troubles and it doesn't happen. Maybe so, maybe so. But Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, and it happens to be the part for which you have a ministerial responsibility. And if you choose to impose something on them, whether they greatly like it or whether they don't, that's it. You can do it, can't you? Or is there something that I've misunderstood?
No, of course you can take things through the House of Commons. You can, I mean, as was done at the time of Mr. Pryor's propositions in the early 80s, and as happened with the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and both those pieces of government legislation secured very large majorities in the House of Commons. But my preoccupation, and indeed the preoccupation of anybody who has to deal with Northern Ireland, and indeed with the affairs of Ireland as a whole, is to find things that will work. Not to find things that you put in place and then people don't cooperate with, because one of the differences between what we were doing in the course of the last 2 years and what had been done ever since '76 was that ever since '76 somebody had stayed away. In other words, somebody had decided that they weren't going to play, and that's the wrong way to phrase it, but they weren't going to participate in what we were engaged in. If you're going to have something which will work, it's actually, and is going to last, you've actually got to have something which has everybody's thumbprints on it. Now, I realise there may be different ways in which we get to that point. There may be different ways in which we get to that point, but that's important if you actually want to have something which will stay.
You see, that last answer reveals that you've got agreement firmly embedded in your mind as being the only real way forward, though you concede that there could be imposition. The reason that you give me for not having imposition is, I think, that it would be unworkable. Now, explain to me why it would be unworkable.
Well, it's workable. It's workable in a. I mean, it's potentially workable in a narrow sense, in the sense that Mr. Pryor's assembly, you know, came into being, and the assembly met, and it had a speaker, and it conducted its affairs, and it cross-examined ministers. But it wasn't something to which everybody was prepared to subscribe. And my view, if you're actually wanting to have something which will resolve these matters, rather than something that will fill the next 2 or 3 years, you've actually got to get something to which the leaders of the political parties can say to their constituencies, this is the proposition which I have accepted on behalf of, we have accepted on your behalf. And unless you do that, I remark absolutely in passing, the terrorist will continue to say that the politicians, in fact, can't agree on a policy, that you are actually having to have something which is imposed from outside and not something which springs from Northern Ireland itself.
Well, you know, Secretary of State, I'm not so sure about that at all. You've chosen one of the things that you might impose. I mean, there are a number of things you could impose, but you've chosen power sharing. All right, now that seems quite a sensible suggestion. Let's think about power sharing. You're trying to do it through agreement. I put it to you earlier, you'll never get it. If you imposed it, you say, well, it wouldn't work, you see, they'd be all upset about it, they might not come. In the first place, you can't be sure that they wouldn't. Secondly, supposing they didn't, the opportunities are there for them to come, supposing the Catholics decided not to turn up. How long would it be before the Catholic electorate said, but that's ridiculous, you've got the chance of some power sharing, go. Supposing the Protestants decided not to turn up. How long would it be before there'd be pressure on them not to let the province be run by the Catholics? And you say it would be bad for them to have to go to their supporters and say, it's being imposed on us. Would it? Think about it. Supposing they could go along and say, look, we haven't agreed to this, to their extremists, and they've all got some. We haven't agreed to this. It's this chap Brooke. He's imposed it on us. But since he has, we might as well work it now, mightn't we? Because we don't want the other lot to have all the power.
Well, what you've done, if you'll forgive my saying so, is to actually put into my mouth something that I'd never emerged from my mouth, which was that power sharing policy would be what I would impose.
No, I didn't say that. I said it was a reasonable. You could do many things by direct rule, but that was one. What you came on to power sharing. That's a reasonable.
But clearly there are a number of things.
Indeed. But what's wrong with imposing power sharing?
Could in fact be imposed. Well, again, I mean, while I recognise that there's going to continue to be a disagreement between us as to how far you can actually affect agreement between the parties, it is a fact that in terms of almost half the district councils in Northern Ireland, we now have arrangements, not imposed by me in any sense, where the parties themselves have come together and agreed the manner in which that particular district council is going to occur. Now, that's been perhaps imposed by the realities of the situation, because it's a reflection of the particular votes, or the particular number of seats in which each council has. But that's happened. In other words, that's worked because they've agreed that that's what they're going to do. A process where whichever party it was decided that they were going to absent themselves because they disliked the arrangements which a British Secretary of State had imposed, in my view, does not actually constitute not only a continuing basis, but also a continuing basis which puts pressure upon the terrorist because it marginalises him through the fact that there's agreement within the community as a whole.
Well, you see, I have some doubts about that answer too, Secretary of State. Indeed, a number of doubts about it. It isn't at all clear to me why the absence of one party, no doubt for a very limited period, is so disastrous in regard to power sharing. What is even less clear to me is, all right, there's some cooperation not imposed by you going on at local level, but for all those viewers watching who don't think you will ever get agreement to province-wide power sharing, it isn't at all apparent why imposing it on them so that they can say to their supporters, well, we didn't have any chance. He made us do it, and do it anyway. Why this is a worse alternative, or worse from the point of view of security, than what we've got already, which is no progress at all, and a very bad security situation.
No, what you're saying is that, let's make it July 1992, because we know for certain that by then an election will have taken place, that in July 1992, a new government should in fact impose, whoever it is, should impose a particular proposition on the province. The complaint which the parties would in my view, perfectly reasonably have, if you were to do that, would be to say, but you certainly haven't exhausted exploring whether or not we can reach agreement. We have embarked on talks. They have been talks which have been limited as to time, and certain factors used up the time. But what we've not done is to test either whether we can reach agreement or whether, in the course of talks, if you were to come and put a proposition at our invitation, which we could accept, whether we can't in fact resolve it that way. Now, if you were to complete that process, and were at that stage, if you like, to have reached a dead end, to have reached buffers where it was perfectly clear that you couldn't carry that process on any further, then clearly it would be legitimate for the British government to say, in the light of the inability of the parties in Northern Ireland to reach agreement, we have no choice but to make such an imposition. But you certainly shouldn't do that until you've exhausted the possibility among the parties themselves.
Well, it could be, I don't know whether you've exhausted the possibilities. It could be that you're very rapidly exhausting the patience of people on the mainland with this cumbersome process. After all, 2 years just to come and sit down. However, I detected something of greater interest in that answer. That, is it in the back of your mind that you might, after the election, in July or August, when you sit down to resume these talks, make it quite clear that, in fact, if there is no significant progress within a limited period, then you will give very serious consideration to imposing some sort of settlement?
Well, if we come out of an election, I've said what I expect the new Secretary of State to do, but certainly the tactical possibility which you've described is one which would be available to him. But I mean, that's frankly something which one would consider as and when one was dealing with the situation after the election rather than now.
Since you may well be in this job, how does it appeal to you?
The imposition of a proposition?
Well, after giving them yet another chance to see if they can agree about anything that matters, and it becoming quite apparent that they're not going to, how would you react then?
Well,
you, Peter Brooke.
That's straightforward. I mean, if it is perfectly clear, and I have the advantage so far of having been the one person who's been involved in all the conversations that we've had so far, if it was clear to me at the end of the process which we've been talking about that there was going to be no way, even on the basis of a proposition put by me at their invitation, for us to reach agreement, then by definition you would have exhausted that series of possibilities. But imposition under those circumstances is a much more reasonable and acceptable thing to the people of the province than it would be until you've exhausted the possibilities of agreement.
Sure. If there is no progress, how long would you give it?
Well, my own view, based on the experience we've had so far, is that you actually do have to allow a certain amount of time. That's partly a function of the longevity of the problem. We're dealing with problems which are centuries in the making, and to think you're going to solve a problem like that in a year or two, which is a hiccup in history, is in my view, would be a mistake. But patently, I would have thought that the moment that you're describing would be likely to come, assuming you had an ordinary 5-year parliament, would be likely to come in the life of that parliament.
Ah, so certainly you're not going to give it more than another 5 years?
No, you wouldn't, in fact, unless you fail to get into conversations at all. There is a limit to how much you can say about the subjects we've been talking about, and indeed there's widespread agreement among the politicians that once you actually get down to real substance, the conversations would be reasonably quick.
And to be frank, Secretary of State, since you wouldn't run the 5 years, because that would bump you into the next election, we're really talking, I suppose, about 3 or 4 years. All right, then let me ask you this. Supposing your mind, as indeed many people think is the case, you never get them to do anything that is constructive, and you do decide to impose a settlement, is it reasonable to think that the settlement you will impose is power sharing?
No, I think you have to make that decision on the basis of the conversations that you've had. I mean, I described earlier.
What alternatives might there be?
Well, patently you have the opportunity of adopting a policy relating to integration. That's again a potential policy which you could have, but you'd be doing it. Remember, you'd be making your decision against the background of all the conversations which you'd had, which had led up to the point of reaching an impasse.
Well, yes. You say integration. Wouldn't that require a modification of the Anglo-Irish Agreement?
Well, there are certainly things that you can do within the agreement, and the word integration, just as the word devolution, in a sense, covers a series of shades of meaning as to what would actually be happening. There are certainly aspects of what people in Northern Ireland would describe as integration, which you can carry out without a modification of the agreement.
This has been a fascinating interview, Mr. Brooke. Would I be in any way unjust to you if I said in the course of the many, many things you've said, one thing you've made absolutely clear, that you are in effect offering some sort of deadline if the Conservative government is re-elected and you remain Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, you are not going to go on into infinity with no progress being made. If after 3 or 4 years no progress is made, then you will impose a settlement.
No, I said that anybody coming back in July of 1992, and necessarily I must speak for my party, I can't speak for any other party, that you would explore in the fullest possible way whether you can actually reach agreement. If you cannot, because I actually think that the democratic vacuum in Northern Ireland is actually bad for Northern Ireland, and I make that observation as a Democrat, then you would in fact you would have to consider stating what the position in future was going to be.
You're offering them a kind of deadline. Do you think that will produce any desirable results?
Well, a deadline, what the form of the deadline would take, I mean, what time you would allow for conversations is something which would develop in negotiation. But deadlines themselves, on the whole, have their hazards in these affairs.
Mr. Brooke, thank you very much indeed.
Straight or make amends, we're dead. Let's go to bed.
Why?
I'm tired, aren't you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, go to the same bed.
I thought you wanted to, don't you?
Yeah, of course. But I expected...
What?
I don't know. Something first.
What?
Oh, well, I don't know. Dinner or something. Get a kiss.